Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to unraveling the journey of being authentic in the workplace. I'm your host, Sandhya Sadakar, and today it's going to be a special episode all about the Enneagram. You've probably heard me mention the Enneagram framework in several episodes, and I share it often as a tool for understanding yourself better and for working more effectively with your team. So I figured it was about time that I did a more comprehensive overview of it and offer up some ways that you could explore it for yourself. So, this is part one of a two-part series. I'm going to give you an overview of the Enneagram, and we're going to talk about how to apply it in your career or on your team. And in this episode, episode 20, part one, it's going to be all about what is the Enneagram, how do you determine your type, and we're going to go through each of the 9 types. In the next episode, episode 21, it's going to be part 2, and that will be all about okay, now once you've identified your dominant type, what do you go do with that? We'll talk through some of the layers in how you can use it in your career as an individual and with your team as a team leader or a team member to work more effectively together. So, this podcast, Working Your Way, is all about authenticity at work. So, we're talking about personality tests and behavioral tools. What do these types of assessments have to do with authenticity, really? And I've always said that authenticity is sometimes more about unlearning than it is about learning. It's about knowing who you are and aligning that with how you show up in the world and what you do. But we have to know ourselves deeply, which can be really hard to do in a fast moving world. And it's because we often change and we don't always check back in with ourselves. Sometimes the things that worked for us years ago don't work for us anymore. And it's also easy to take on what the external world expects of us because we're conditioned to show up in a certain way based on our social identity, or we might internalize messages that we receive about what success looks like or how we're supposed to go about reaching our goals. So we have to shed these layers and we have to do that to get back to the true us. So, what assessments or typologies or really any kind of self awareness tool can help us do are really 3 things. One, building awareness of ourselves and how we operate, and then giving us the language to describe that. Because we don't always objectively see our perspective or our behavior because we live it every day. It's like you're underwater and you don't see the water that you're swimming in. So, having a tool that really helps us to build that awareness and come up with the language to articulate it is really critical in understanding ourselves. And the second one is building context of how others operate and giving us the language to describe that so that we can see how we're different from others. Because as humans, human nature is to assume a lot of other people think and believe the same things that we do or behave the same way that we do. And so when we can see how we're different from others and again, name it, give the language to it, we can really contextualize, okay, I'm this way and that person's that way. And the third thing is that there's really often a gap between how we feel on the inside or who we want to be and how we're showing up on the outside. And self awareness combined with having the words can really help us bridge that gap. And I'll give you an example of this. So, I'm usually someone who is very open to feedback because I always want to learn and I always want to get better. But when I was a manager years ago, I remember having a conversation with my team where I asked somebody at some point why they didn't bring up an idea earlier. And one of my employees at the time said to me, well, you seemed like you knew what you were talking about, so I didn't question it. And with that, I realized that my team wasn't proactively offering up ideas and opinions because the way that I was showing up to them felt confident and almost directive. So they didn't think I was looking for different opinions or potential new ideas. I actually needed to bridge that gap by understanding that that's the way I come across, and then by communicating my intentions more clearly by saying things like, hey, I'm sharing one way we can go about this, but I'm really open to what your ideas are. I don't actually have the answer. So, what do you think? So, let's get into the Enneagram. And I know you might be really itching to hear about your type, and I get it. If you want to skip ahead, go for it. However, I do think that it's really important to understand the context of the tool and how you should kind of approach finding your type. So, we're going to start there. So, what is the Enneagram and what makes it unique and effective? It's often referred to as a personality assessment, and it does help us build awareness of our traits and our behavioral patterns, but I consider it more of a tool for growth. So we can understand our personality, but what differentiates this tool from others, in my perspective, is that it's not just about our behaviors, but it's actually more about the core motivations that drive those behaviors. So I consider it more of a tool for self understanding and for developing our emotional intelligence versus kind of a static point in time assessment of how you show up. So when I talk about behaviors versus motivations, for example, if I have a pattern of not being able to give up control on projects, that's the behavior. That's how I'm showing up. That's how you might experience me. But it could be driven by several different internal motivations. One could be the need to be right and good. And if someone else does it, it won't be done the right way. Another could be I have the need to be strong. And if someone else does it, it makes me look weak, or it might put the outcome or the total project at risk, or might have some weakness in the outcomes. A whole different motivation could be the need to be successful, and anyone else leading it would slow down the results, or it might take the credit or the recognition away from me and my contributions. So, what's interesting about this is in each of these scenarios, the behavior is the same: controlling, not delegating, micromanaging. But the reason why that behavior is showing up is different. The deeper rooted need that wants to be met is not the same for each person, even though sometimes the behavior can be the same. So, when we can identify what's at the root of things that we want to change, we can kind of address those patterns more effectively. Instead of just trying to will ourselves to change, we can say, wow, my controlling behavior is actually about my need to feel like I'm a good person and that I'm always doing things the right way. And now I can name that. I can treat myself with some compassion, and I can realize that the outcome of this project has no bearing on my goodness as a human. I can also do the work to heal and build up my self regulation skills to ensure that I don't fall into that pattern of controlling, because I'm tying it to this much bigger meaning about who I am. So, we're going to talk about this part a lot more in part 2 of this series in episode 21. In the Enneagram, there are 9 types, each with their own core motivations, fears, desires, and patterns. So let's talk first about finding your Enneagram type. Here is what you need to know. With the Enneagram system, it's more complex than just taking a test and having the results tell you your type. No one can tell you your type. I can't even tell you your type. But I can offer up some suggestions on which types maybe to explore first or how to narrow it down. And I can share my perspective of what I hear from you. But from there, it's really up to you. And finding your type is a really personal experience. It requires reflection and observation. Because finding your type is about the underlying and sometimes subconscious core motivations that drive your behavior, we aren't always aware or present to them. Therefore, an online test is not going to be an accurate way of determining your motivations, because they might not even be something that you're fully aware of. And sometimes the online tests do work. The latest statistic I heard was about 40 to 45% accuracy when you take a test that your top score is going to actually be your dominant Enneagram type. So 40% of the time, it'll actually be your correct type. But 60% of the time, there's a lot more nuance there. And so the test is really testing for behavior. They're testing for conscious behavior and not for why you behave that way. So, my suggestion would be, if you like to take an online assessment, go ahead and take the test and use it to narrow down the options. Maybe use it to find your top 2 or 3 scores. And then from there, really do your own reading and exploration of each of those types. Or you can start by really reading through all the types. And I'm going to link some resources in the show notes about all of this. But you can read through all the types and then observe yourself. Maybe try on a type for a couple of days and then try on a different one. I would start by narrowing down the options, maybe eliminating the ones that you know are not true for you, and then spend a couple of days considering how your behaviors are showing up, why you're behaving that way. Take a couple of days and say, okay, if I were a type 2, I'd be doing these things for this reason, and see how true that feels for you in those couple of days. And then the next couple of days, you'd say, okay, if I were a type 9, I'd be doing these things for this reason, and try that one on. Often, when we call something out, like as an example for the type 3, they can be often focused on their image. So if I were to say, am I really focused on my image? We can all of a sudden catch ourselves in the act when we're doing it. But before we name it, it often runs in the background, almost like this operating system that's so well built and efficient that we don't even know it's running. So if I call it out or I get curious with myself, I might go through the next few days saying, wow, I actually do think about my image a lot and I never really realized it. So let's talk about some basics of the Enneagram system. In the theory of the Enneagram, we do have all 9 types in us. So we're going to find some part of every type that we do resonate or that feels like it shows up for us. And the types are based on these core human needs. So all of them are going to apply to us in some way. But we have one dominant type that stays the same for our entire lives. So we don't change Enneagram types as we grow or change or evolve. And there are no good or bad types. There are just different ways of viewing the world. Now, while our type doesn't change throughout our lives, the ways that we express the motivation, so our behaviors, they definitely do change. We grow up, we evolve, we have more traumas that we experience, we go to therapy, we heal, and on, right? We have these kind of cycles of the human experience. And there are a lot of other dynamics in the Enneagram system that can kind of show us how we move around, but we're not going to be able to get to all of them here. Just know that we do change and evolve throughout life. But that doesn't mean that the dominant type or that kind of core motivation that drives you is going to be different at different stages of life. And since this podcast is so much about authenticity, I have to add in here a little bit about identity and how I think this tool is inclusive and how I think it's maybe not inclusive in the ways that we use it today. So, our behaviors come from lots of different places. You're probably familiar with the idea of nature versus nurture. But in this system, it's believed that you're born with the propensity for that one core motivation. So, in essence, the Enneagram type is more nature. But the ways that we express the type motivation are probably more nurture. Those are going to be based on how we grew up and how we've evolved since then. So, as an example, if I have a core motivation to be good or to be right or to be correct in this world, the ways that I express that are largely, probably initially at least, going to be based on what I was brought up to believe is good versus bad, or right versus wrong, or good versus evil. So, as we talk about this system, I also want to acknowledge some of the limitations of the materials that are out there. So, the websites and the books and the teachings have historically not come from a very diverse set of people. And said another way, if we think about who wrote the books about the modern Enneagram that we have access to today, they were largely cisgender, straight, white, upper class males. And what this means is that while the core motivation really has nothing to do with identity, it's truly universal. It's a universal human need. And our social identity doesn't have any correlation to the core motivation. The behaviors that result from that motivation are going to be mostly in the context of how the people who wrote the books or the people who taught the classes or the people who were part of the research to create the concepts would express that motivation. So here's an example. The type 8 has a core desire to be strong and self reliant and not to be controlled. When an American white male type 8 expresses that motivation, it's going to look very different than, for example, a type 8 who is an American female of Asian descent. The type 8 is said to outwardly express anger frequently, which might be how some people show up. But if you're an Asian female in America, you might not have felt safe to be outwardly angry. And oftentimes, women have to think about their safety first over self expression. Or culturally, it may not be very acceptable to express anger. So that also plays a role too. And that doesn't mean that a type 8 Asian female doesn't get angry, but it could be more repressed or just more felt, but not outwardly expressed. So we can see where these kind of layers of our identity might shape the way the core motivation shows up. So it's important as you're exploring your type, when you're trying to identify your dominant type, consider how your identity might play a role. Identifying your dominant Enneagram type is always about how closely you identify with the core motivations, core fears, and core desires of the type. Not that your behavior matches up 100% to what's listed on a website or in a book or on social media about that type. So if you remember one thing about finding your type, it's that only you know what's driving your behavior, and your type will align with that internal core motivation and not always align perfectly with the ways that that motivation shows up through the behaviors that are listed in the materials that you might look up. Okay, so let's get into the 9 different types. Now, the motivations in the 9 Enneagram types ladder up to 3 core human needs. There are 3 centers of intelligence in the Enneagram type, which each of the type fits into one of these centers. So 9 different types, 3 different centers of intelligence, 3 types fit into each center of intelligence. And we're going to talk about the unique types of intelligence more in part 2 or episode 21. But for now, focus on the idea that we are all whole human beings who need 3 core things, no matter what your type. We need to be safe, we need to be loved, and we need to be free. And most of the time, we have all of these things technically. But the way that our nervous systems work, they often perceive a modern day threat like a conflict with someone that you care about as a threat to your survival or to the core needs, your core need of safety or your core need of love. And depending on your type, you may not always feel that you have those needs met, as in your body thinks it's not safe or it's not loved or it's not free. And you then go do things to try to go get it. I need to repair this connection. If I feel conflict with someone I care about, I have to repair that connection in order to feel like I'm loved and I'm safe in this world. When in reality, you're still safe. So, as we go through each of the types, I'm going to highlight the core motivations and how they show up and where the focus of the attention goes for each type. You might often hear names like the achiever or the perfectionist or the skeptic when it comes to the Enneagram types. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to them with what I think is really their main way of interacting with the world and kind of the most critical talent that they bring to the table. So let's start with the type 1. Type 1s are improvement oriented. Type 1s see how things can be improved through their attention to detail and their kind of natural sense of order and rightness in the world. The core motivation is to be right, to strive higher and improve everything, and to be consistent with their ideals and standards. They really want to avoid being wrong or making mistakes or being open to criticism, and they often also want to avoid feeling angry. But when things aren't done right, or when there's an injustice or someone's incorrect and not acknowledging that, they may feel this kind of frustration or irritation. Oftentimes, they won't necessarily identify it as anger because it's a little bit repressed. And frankly, in their mind, good people don't get angry. So, the key themes for this type, there can be a really strong kind of inner critic and sometimes a strong outer critic. They can be very critical when things don't meet these really high standards that they have for themselves and for others, or for the outcome of something that they're doing with others. And so there can be a lot of control. There's a lot of attention also to virtue or ethics or morals, and they're really focused on reforming things. Their attention goes to right and wrong, especially the things that need to be corrected. They have these really high internal standards, and I guarantee almost all type ones are harder on themselves than they are on other people, but it can translate into external criticism of others. And they often can kind of compare themselves to others in this sense. So there's a lot of self monitoring, self evaluation, not making time for fun and joy because there's always more work to do. And so a type one is going to say, if you want it done right, do it yourself. And they have an idea of how it should be done in their head. And when they take on too much because they feel like they have to be the ones to take it on in order to do it right, there can be a lot of resentment with that. So next up is type two. Type twos are relationship oriented. Type twos understand the needs of others and they know how to meet them. Their core motivation is to be loved, to express their feelings for others, to be needed, and to be appreciated. They are constantly sensing what others need and meeting those needs. But they often avoid their own needs, or they're just not present to what it is that they actually need. They also really want to avoid being unwanted or feeling any sort of personal rejection. So the key themes for this type are they're super helpful. They're there when you need them. They're actually there before you even know that you need them. And they have this kind of warmth or seductiveness to them. It's like they draw you in. They have this really deep connection to people and a high level of emotional sensitivity. And so their attention goes to focusing on the needs and the wants of other people and kind of altering themselves to meet other people's needs. They can often reference themselves based on other people's behaviors, and they're really tuned into feelings. Now, what can happen with a type two is when they're out there seeing that, oh, you have this problem, you need this thing fixed, or you need help with this thing, like, let me go and do this for you. And this comes from a sense of pride of like, I know what you need. But oftentimes we might be like, that's not what I need. That's what you think I need. Or I don't even recognize that I need that yet. So, like, get out of my kitchen. And this pride can often be a little intrusive in that sense. So let's move on to type three. Type threes are achievement oriented. Type threes understand what needs to be done and they achieve their goals really successfully and efficiently. So the core motivation for the type three is to be valuable. It's to be and be seen as successful. And they want to earn recognition. And this can be work related, but it can also be in other roles in their life. And so, of course, a lot of times this comes through career recognition and climbing the corporate ladder. But it can also be other roles that you've deemed or your community has deemed to be important, like being a great mother or being the perfect best son. And so we think about being successful in those roles as what the three is really striving to achieve. And they want to, at all costs, avoid failure. They want to avoid disapproval from other people and they want to avoid rejection. So the key themes for this type are there's often a lot of achievement or competition, focusing on achievements or focusing on being the best. And that doesn't necessarily mean at sports or kind of in a traditional sense, but like always wanting to be better than the others in the room or be better than the former version of themselves. And there can often be a lot of image management with the type three. So they're constantly thinking about what others think of them, how others see them, how they're being perceived. And there's a really strong social intelligence that then helps them kind of have this radar for how are people perceiving me and what do I need to shift in myself to move into that image of what they would want to be. So their intention often goes to all the tasks that are to be accomplished, getting recognition or being valued for those accomplishments, how others perceive them, and then self empowerment and self improvement. So there's this kind of eye on potential when it comes to competition and being the best. It's like, how do I be the best version of myself? How do I improve myself so that I can be the best? Now, what happens is there can be a lot of overworking and there can be a lot of focus on what other people see as successful. And so they can kind of lose themselves in this achievement. And oftentimes this leads to burnout, whether that's physical burnout from overwork or emotional burnout from chasing goals that really aren't fulfilling to the individual. So, next, let's talk about type 4. Type 4 is expression oriented. Type 4s can connect to emotion and they can express themselves through their empathy and their creativity. Their core motivation is to express themselves and their individuality. They also want to create beauty in the world and they want to tend to their and the other people's emotional needs. So think about beauty and emotion and the human experience being a really big part of how the type 4 moves through the world. And what they want to avoid is being ordinary or lacking identity or feeling inadequate. They don't want to just be regular, they want to be extraordinary. And so they also tend to avoid anything that feels like inauthenticity or may focus on that, and that can really drain them. So the key themes for this type is they have this empathetic ability to really deeply, deeply feel, to deeply connect to other people's emotions. But there can also be a lot of sadness or maybe a feeling of longing or what's lacking or what they're missing as a person. And they're really focused on aesthetics and beauty and creativity and just making the world more beautiful and creative and exciting. So their attention often goes to kind of what is missing or what's not available or what's negative in the present moment because they are quite comfortable with these kind of deep, dark, sad emotions. So they focus a lot on feelings and they focus a lot on the extremes in life. And what can come along with this, where that can go wrong, is kind of indulging in their emotions a lot, really like getting into that and not then kind of pulling themselves out of it and taking action against some of the things, or kind of just bringing a sense of like perspective to what's really going on here. Next up is the type 5. So, type 5s are analysis oriented. Type 5s solve really complex problems by observing and analyzing all types of situations. Their core motivation is to possess knowledge, to be competent, to understand the environment that they're in, and to really have everything figured out. And they do this by learning, by becoming experts on things, by gathering all the data, whether that's looking up information or finding actual data or observing social situations to kind of put the pieces together. And they want to avoid being incompetent or feeling incompetent. They really want to avoid feeling helpless or incapable because then they have to ask others for help. And that's something that they also want to avoid is having to be reliant on other people. And they really want to avoid wasting of resources, whether that's their own energy, their own emotional energy, their own mental energy, or actual resources external to themselves. So the key themes for this type, there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of processing information, and there's a real eye on self-sufficiency. Like, how do I make sure I have enough resources to be safe in this world? I don't want to ask other people for them because that leaves me open to danger. And so they focus on self-sufficiency. They also can be kind of emotionally detached or maybe overly rational about things that we all know as humans, emotions are core to the human experience and you can't get away from them, but they like to kind of go into this hyper rational space or kind of pull away if they're feeling emotionally overwhelmed. So their attention goes to kind of outwardly observing and scanning and like taking in all the information. They can sometimes dissociate or detach to kind of get emotions out of the way. And they can be very self contained and controlled and compartmentalize things. And so, where this can go wrong is pulling away from people when they feel like they don't have the emotional understanding to solve the problem, so they can isolate themselves. Or I've heard type 5 say like, I want to retreat into my mind palace because when I'm up there I know everything and I know all the things there are to know and I don't have to deal with a problem that I don't know how to solve. Okay, so let's move on to the type 6. Type 6s are security oriented. Type 6s can spot potential problems and they can mitigate risks in order to create security both for themselves and for the greater good. Their core motivation is to have security, to feel supported by others, to have reassurance through people and preparation. And so this can look like having all the supplies you need for a road trip, or it could look like building this amazing network of people that they know who to go to for all sorts of different problems. They want to avoid uncertainty. They want to avoid unpredictability. They want to avoid being unprepared. And so they're constantly kind of collecting resources in that sense, whether it's people or things or knowledge, in order to make sure that they will always have a solution to the problem or they always have an out when things go wrong. The key themes for this type are this kind of hypervigilance. It's like this idea of, I always know what might go wrong in any kind of situation. I'm constantly thinking about it. I'm worrying about it a lot. And that can lead them to have kind of some doubt or ambivalence, whether it's self doubt or doubt of others, kind of contrarian thinking. I can always see the opposite side of the situation and plan for it. And they also have a really interesting authority kind of orientation. So some are really reverent to authority and they could consider themselves like rule followers, and some are really kind of rebelling against authority. And it can be situational. So the same two things can be existent in the same person. They can, in some instances, be really a rule follower, and others really question authority and challenge it. And their attention really goes to focusing on what could go wrong at any given point and really magnifying that. Or they really want to figure things out and be prepared. They're thinking a lot. Their implications of things, what's going to happen next, and then next, and then next. They can like project out into the future and scenario plan, and really scanning to explain their kind of inner sense of threat. If they feel this kind of internal sense of danger or threat, they'll project it onto something outside of themselves. And so where that can go wrong is kind of projecting those inner fears outward, or maybe overly relying on others because they feel safer if someone else makes a decision or tells them what to do. The next type is the type 7. So type 7s are possibility oriented. Type 7s envision new possibilities or new outcomes for a situation all the time. Their core motivation is to maintain their freedom and happiness. They want to have worthwhile experiences. They want to keep themselves excited. And in that, they're constantly kind of coming up with new things, new ideas, trying new hobbies, moving from thing to thing really quickly because they want to avoid, one, being bored or the mundane things in life, but they also really want to avoid pain and suffering. So if there's boredom in the present or sadness in the present or some kind of pain in the present, they're often trying to go into the future to avoid that pain or that boredom. They also really want to avoid being limited or being restricted or being deprived of anything that they want in any sort of way. And so the key themes for this type, they're what's called self-referencing. They have a really good sense of what it is going to take to make them happy, and they know how to go after it. They also often can be positive and optimistic, but in a sense of like constantly reframing negative things as positive. So they're like ultimate silver lining seekers, which can be annoying to people when somebody just wants to be heard, but they always are finding the good in things, or oh, this must have happened for a reason. So they also kind of avoid anything that feels like a limitation, a restriction of their potential or their options. And they can sometimes have a lack of focus and be scattered and kind of all over the place or bouncing around from this idea to that idea to that idea. What their attention goes to is really imagining the multiple options and planning for these exciting and pleasurable possibilities. They are great at interconnecting and interrelating information. Think about synthesizing a lot of different things and bringing them into one. And they often think about how they can escape limitation or what feels good to them in the moment. And so, where this can go wrong is that they can be scattered and uncommitted. They can not follow through on the things that they say they're going to do, which can be frustrating to people in their lives. All right, moving on to the type 8. So, type 8s are action oriented. Type 8s take charge, they move into action, and they get things done. Their core motivation is to be self reliant, to prove their strength, to dominate their environment sometimes, or just to stay in control of the situation. And so they do this by taking charge. They have a lot of energy. And so they can jump into action and get things done. And in order to stay in control of their environment or make sure that they have their autonomy, they can take over things. What they want to avoid is vulnerability or weakness. So, how things might fail, if they do them, they can kind of assure that the outcome is going to be strong or protected. And they really want to avoid being controlled by others, being micromanaged, being told what to do. That's a real trigger for type 8s. So, the key themes for this type are they have a real willingness to confront things. They actually often can be accused of being confrontational. They want to be met in debate. Actually, for them, that's like the realness in life is like, challenge me, like, tell me where I'm wrong, like, meet me in debate versus just doing what I tell you to do. They also experience quite a bit of anger, and whether they express it externally or not, that's one thing that we talked about in terms of like social identity might play a role in this, but they have a real visceral sense of when their autonomy is threatened, when someone's being taken advantage of, when there's injustice or something is not fair, feeling that viscerally in their body. They really focus a lot on autonomy and dominance, and their attention goes to who has power, who's in control. They think a lot about action and assertiveness and immediacy. It's like there's an urge, I must take care of it right now, instead of kind of taking a breath and taking a beat and waiting to see, okay, is this something that really needs to be done? Do we need to connect? Do we need to explore more information? And so they really live in these extremes and excess. It's kind of like an all or nothing kind of existence. And they are really focused on fairness and justice and where those things are not present. Now, where this can go wrong is not like checking their power or their impact and thinking about how taking charge of things or getting really big and dominating an environment can impact others in negative ways. And last but not least is the type 9. So, type 9s are harmony oriented. And this kind of superpower of the type 9s is to be able to create harmony by hearing and incorporating a lot of diverse perspectives. So the type 9 has this core motivation to have inner peace and feel like this sense of calm on the inside and then create harmony in their environment. So oftentimes they want to preserve things as they are because change and disruption feels chaotic to them, whether it's external or internal. And so they want to avoid oftentimes disruptive change, conflict, tension, separation, or loss. All of these things make them feel like things are not harmonious, whether it's external or internal, and they really like to avoid these things at all costs. And so the key themes for this type are they are super easygoing. They're really kind of adaptable and they could go along with a group almost all of the time. And the challenge can be here is they can kind of tell themselves that they don't have an opinion or a preference when actually sometimes they do. So that kind of indecision or I don't care, what do you want to do, or I don't know what I want to do next, or just going along with the group, it's kind of this over adjustment or this merging with the other people around them, and their attention often goes to the agenda of other people or what other people's opinions are, what other people want. They go into avoiding discomfort or avoiding conflict, pleasing others, or they lose themselves in other people, or kind of not paying attention to what's right in front of them or the next steps that they can take. And so this can kind of look like indecisiveness or resistance to moving forward when not being used as a strength. Okay, so that was all of the 9 types. I'm curious, was there one that really stood out for you? Did you hear some things, a couple of things, and a couple of different types that felt really true to you? And as you're exploring this, make sure you're going back to those core motivations. The resources that I'm going to link in the show notes will have those so you can visually look at it if that's an easier way to kind of go about this. But a few things that are important to highlight when we're using a tool like this, it's important to use it both responsibly and inclusively. And I think this is important for you as an individual, but especially when it comes to an organization or a team. If you are a leader and using this on your team, first of all, our personalities don't define us. We are not our behaviors. However, building awareness of them is important, and seeing how you can grow and evolve as a person or as an employee or as a leader is really important. So we're building awareness here, but we're not defining ourselves by our personality traits. Second, we should never, ever, ever use a personality assessment to hire or evaluate or make decisions about people. Like, oh, she's a type 8, so she'll be a good leader. Or, oh, I want to marry a type 2 because they're really giving. No, that is so much more important to look at where an individual is in their awareness and their development than what type they are. And last, these types of tools should never be used to put people in boxes or to make excuses for our own behavior or to make assumptions about people because we know their type. The objective is to see our differences as differences, not as my way is the right way and your way is the wrong way, but our two approaches to life or work are different and they're equally valuable for different reasons. And now that I have the context of this framework, I can see how those differences are both really valuable. When we highly identify with a behavioral box or label, like, oh, I'm just really type A, it can limit our range. We could say, well, I need to be in control because I'm a type A. Kind of lets us off the hook and we don't have to grow or change or evolve. And while I don't think that we should over identify with any label, at least when we identify with a motivational label, it can still kind of allow for that range. With a core motivation, like the need to be good and right, or the need to be successful or to be seen as successful, we can see how that motivation leads us to feel that things need to be done a certain way, or I need to chase certain goals. But we can loosen our beliefs around that because as we build awareness, we can begin to accept that my way is always the right way, or this definition of success isn't universal. And when we have a sense of agency in how we show up and express that motivation, that we can use it in really positive ways. So, my need to be good helps me become someone who wants to make the world a better place, or my need to be successful or be seen as successful helps me see the potential in others and help them be more successful. And we can take action then to make those things happen. So, I hope this was a helpful overview of the types with some more context about the system and how you can find your type. I'd love to hear what stood out to you in this episode. And in part two, I'll share more about how we can use the Enneagram in our careers as individuals and on our teams as a leader or as a teammate to work better together. So, in terms of recommending some resources to explore about the Enneagram, I want you to think about this list of resources as start here, and then if you need more, go to the next one, and then if you need even more, go to the next one. There is no glory in identifying your type right away. No one gets a trophy for figuring it out the fastest, and I'm talking to you type 3s. But some of you might have listened to this episode and you already know your type, and that is great for you. And some of you may be more confused now than you were when we were started, and that's okay too. So start exploring one step at a time. And instead of just diving in and reading everything all at once, maybe explore one of the resources in the show notes and then just observe yourself for a few days and see what you notice, and then move on to the next one. So, first, I would recommend doing some reflection. And for this, I have a guide that's intended to help you reflect and begin to identify your type. You could start here and go through the Self at Work PDF guide first. That will be linked in the show notes. And then once you've narrowed it down, I would check out one of these two sites, CP Enneagram or the Narrative Enneagram, for some deeper exploration. So, CP Enneagram, there will be a link that will take you to a site with all 9 types, and you can download a free PDF on any one of them once you click into the type. So, I have a guide that's intended to help you reflect. And then once you kind of get narrowed down, go and download just the PDFs for the types that you maybe have narrowed it down to. And then the second site is the Narrative Enneagram. And this is where I did my Enneagram certification. And they have a PDF that has all 9 types. So it's more of a summary, and the link will take you directly to that. And again, there is no need to rush this process. So narrow it down to 2 or 3 types that feel really most true for you. And after you do this self-exploration, and if you still kind of feel confused or stuck, the next place I would look is common mistypings, or You can book a session or consult an expert. And so I'll link to resources here for really sorting out your type or thinking about which types look like other types sometimes or where might they have some overlap. And so the first resource I have is the Narrative Enneagram. It's a type comparison. You scroll about halfway down the section to where it says type comparisons, and you can find the two that you're in between and see what's similar about them, what's different about them. And then also a link to the EnneagramInstitute.com. And this is about misidentification. So you can find the two types that you want to compare between and explore the differences and commonalities that can cause people to mistype. So that was a lot of resources, I think 5 different links there. But again, take them one step at a time. Start with reflection, do a little deeper exploration. And then if you're in that kind of sorting out stage, go look at the type comparisons and the misidentification. Now, if you want some more hands-on support, I and many other Enneagram coaches do typing sessions. So you can just reach out on LinkedIn or Instagram or via my website. My contacts are always listed in the show notes, and we could set something up. So happy exploring, and we'll see you in part 2 for the conversation on, okay, now I know my type, what now? Where we're going to dive into how to use this insight to work your way and to build better teams.